Some men believe they can hide their crimes behind expensive suits and arrogant smiles. My husband was exactly that type. He walked into the courtroom with his beautiful young mistress, mocking my appearance and absolutely certain I would walk away with $0 to my name. But he forgot one very crucial detail. I was the architect who designed his company data system, and I know exactly where all the financial bodies are buried. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now, let's begin the story. My name is Savannah Rivera. I sat perfectly still on the hard, varnished wooden bench in the echoing corridor outside courtroom number 402 at the Cook County Courthouse in Chicago. The marble floors reflected the harsh fluorescent lights overhead, casting long, distorted shadows against the pale walls. Around me, the usual chaos of the legal system buzzed with lawyers whispering to anxious clients, the clatter of heavy briefcases, and the muffled arguments of broken families. However, I existed in a vacuum of freezing, calculated calm. I was waiting for the legal termination of my marriage, but more importantly, I was waiting for a carefully constructed trap to finally spring. The heavy oak doors at the far end of the hallway swung open with an arrogant force. Julian Vance, the man I had called my husband for the past 10 years, strolled through. He did not merely walk, he paraded, commanding the space as if the courthouse were his personal kingdom. Clinging tightly to his left arm was Chloe, his young interior designer mistress. She was 24 years old and looked exactly like the cliché she was playing. She had long, perfectly styled blonde hair, a designer handbag dangling from her wrist, and a tight, cream-colored dress that screamed for attention. She gazed up at Julian with wide, adoring eyes, visibly drunk on the illusion of his wealth and power. Julian's posture was impossibly arrogant. He wore a charcoal gray bespoke suit, tailored to absolute perfection, a garment that likely cost upwards of $5,000. He stopped a few feet away from my bench, looking down at me with a cruel smirk that twisted his handsome features into something ugly and entirely recognizable. He let out a sharp, theatrical laugh, making sure every single person in the corridor could hear him. "Look at you, Savannah," he sneered, his voice dripping with loud, intentional mockery. "You actually wore that pathetic old navy blazer to our divorce? I suppose you cannot afford anything else right now. You look like a tired, washed-up substitute teacher. Did you really think dressing like a beggar would make the judge take pity on you? You are making this embarrassing for yourself." I did not blink. I did not shift my gaze. I merely watched him, a silent observer recording his pathetic display of ego. Before Julian could continue his public performance, his high-priced bulldog of an attorney stepped forward. He was a smug, aggressively manicured man who radiated the same toxic confidence as his client. The lawyer held a thick leather briefcase, snapped it open, and pulled out a heavy stack of legal documents. He thrust them toward me with an arrogant, dismissive flick of his wrist. "Mrs. Vance," the lawyer said smoothly, emphasizing my soon-to-be defunct title with a patronizing tone. "This is the final settlement agreement. Julian is being incredibly generous by even offering this. Sign it now and save us all some time. The terms dictate that you forfeit 100% of your shares in the company, relinquish the primary residence, and give up any and all claims to the joint marital assets. You will walk away with a small, one-time alimony payment of $50,000. If you choose to fight this, we will drag you through the court system for years until you are drowning in hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees. Take the pen and do the smart thing." They stood there, a trio of arrogance, expecting me to break. They anticipated tears. They expected me to scream, to throw a desperate tantrum, or to collapse into a sobbing, defeated mess right there on the cold courthouse floor. But I gave them absolutely nothing. I ignored the thick stack of papers hovering in front of my face. I ignored the lawyer's threats. I looked right through Julian's smug, triumphant eyes as if he were entirely transparent, without uttering a single syllable in response to their profound humiliation. I stood up. My face remained a mask of stone. The bailiff opened the heavy courtroom doors at that exact moment, and I walked past my husband and his mistress in total, suffocating silence. The soft, rhythmic click of my heels was the only sound I made. I entered the grand wood-paneled courtroom, found my designated seat at the petitioner's table, and folded my hands neatly in my lap, staring straight ahead. A few minutes later, the room was ordered to rise as Judge Marcus Thorne took the bench. He was an older man with sharp, uncompromising eyes that had seen every lie a human being could conjure. He sat down, adjusted his silver-rimmed reading glasses, and exhaled a long breath. The court clerk handed him the massive file that Julian's legal team had submitted. The exploitative, one-sided divorce settlement they expected him to blindly rubber stamp. Judge Thorne opened the manila folder. The courtroom fell into a tense, heavy hush. His face, already naturally stern, grew incredibly severe as he began to flip through the pages. He read the terms, his brow furrowing deeper and deeper with every paragraph. His expression radiated a heavy judgmental gravity that seemed to lower the temperature in the room. Julian sat at the table to my right, casually leaning back in his leather chair, a confident, arrogant smile plastered across his face. He was completely oblivious to the fact that his perfect, untouchable world was moments away from catching fire. The heavy silence in the courtroom was suddenly interrupted by the sharp squeak of rubber soles against polished wood. A court clerk, a severe woman carrying a posture of absolute duty, marched straight up to the wooden dais. In her arms, she held a massive, heavily bound file secured with thick steel clips. It was the supplementary evidentiary dossier I had filed with the Records Department precisely 1 hour before the session officially opened. She leaned forward, whispering a hushed sentence to Judge Thorne, and placed the towering stack of documents squarely on top of the pathetic, exploitative settlement offer Julian's legal team had so arrogantly submitted just moments prior. From the corner of my eye, I watched Julian. He let out a soft, condescending scoff. He leaned over the mahogany table, whispering something into the ear of his attorney. The attorney offered a dismissive wave of his manicured hand and chuckled under his breath. They clearly assumed I had submitted a desperate, handwritten plea for spousal support or a pathetic diary detailing my emotional grievances. They had no idea that the heavy binder sitting on the judge's desk was a meticulous, undeniable financial autopsy of their entire operation. Judge Thorne flipped open the heavy cardboard cover of my submission. What followed was the most agonizing, suffocating stretch of time I had ever witnessed in a legal setting. For exactly 10 minutes, the entire courtroom was held entirely hostage by the slow, methodical sound of turning pages. The large analog clock on the back wall ticked with the booming, rhythmic thud of a heart monitor. Every second that passed felt like a physical weight pressing down on the room, thickening the air until it was almost impossible to breathe. I watched the judge's face with a surgeon's precision. His eyes, sharp and analytical, darted back and forth across the dense spreadsheets and authenticated banking logs. I knew exactly which pages he was reading based on the time it took to turn them. I watched his brow furrow. I watched his jaw tighten so hard that the muscles in his cheek twitched. The natural color completely drained from his face, only to be slowly replaced by a deep, dangerous flush of absolute fury. Across the aisle, Julian's posture of invincibility began to actively decay. At minute 3, he unbuttoned his expensive suit jacket, suddenly finding the climate-controlled room too warm. At minute 6, he began tapping his polished Italian leather shoe erratically against the carpet. By minute 9, he was staring fiercely at his lawyer, his eyes wide and demanding, silently pleading to know what could possibly be taking so long. His lawyer did not look back. The man simply swallowed hard, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edge of the defense table. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime suspended in amber, Judge Thorne slowly closed the binder. He removed his silver-rimmed reading glasses and placed them deliberately onto the dark wood. The sharp crack of the metal frame hitting the desk echoed through the dead silent room like a thunderclap. He did not look at my lawyer. He did not look at me. He locked his piercing, furious gaze entirely on the man sitting to my right. "Mr. Vance," Judge Thorne began, his voice dropping an octave into a terrifying register of icy authority. "I strongly suggest you sit up straight. Furthermore, I advise you to take a very long, very deep breath and carefully reconsider the profoundly disrespectful attitude you have brought into my courtroom today." The words hung in the sterile air, heavy and absolutely lethal. Julian completely froze. The arrogant, triumphant smirk that had been permanently etched onto his handsome face was violently wiped clean, replaced by a hollow, gaping look of utter shock. He opened his mouth to formulate a response, but his vocal cords failed him. Not a single sound emerged. His lawyer, abruptly realizing the catastrophic shift in the room's gravity, shot up from his plush chair as if the seat had caught fire. The aggressive smugness had entirely drained from his face, leaving behind a pale, sweaty mask of sheer professional panic. A bailiff had just dropped the defense's mandatory copy of my supplementary binder onto his table. "Your Honor," the lawyer stammered, his voice cracking noticeably on the first syllable. "The defense respectfully requests an immediate 15-minute recess to review this newly submitted documentation and consult privately with my client." "Granted," Judge Thorne snapped back instantly, his tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. "You have exactly 15 minutes. Do not make me wait a single second more." The wooden gavel fell with a final deafening thud that signaled the temporary halt of the proceedings. I remained rooted in my seat, perfectly composed, watching as Julian and his high-priced attorney practically scrambled out of the heavy double doors into the hallway. Moving with the frantic energy of men escaping a burning building, I waited exactly 2 minutes in the quiet courtroom before standing up, smoothing the wrinkles from my navy blazer, and calmly walking out to the corridor. Through the thick, soundproof glass of the corridor doors, I had a front-row view of their total unraveling. They were huddled desperately in a far corner, far away from the busy foot traffic of the courthouse. The attorney had the heavy binder cracked open, his trembling finger jabbing aggressively at the endless rows of highlighted data. Even from a distance, I recognized the specific layout of the page they were staring at. It was the master ledger detailing the hidden offshore transfers. Julian was physically deteriorating right before my eyes. The arrogant king who had strutted into the building was now sweating profusely. Large, dark patches of moisture bloomed rapidly under the arms of his tailored shirt. He ran a shaking hand through his perfectly styled hair, destroying the pristine look, as he stared down at the undeniable, mathematical proof of his own destruction. His chest heaved as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. Standing just 3 feet away from their panicked huddle was Chloe. She was frozen in place like a statue. The radiant, victorious smile she had weaponized against me all morning had evaporated into the cold courthouse air. Her perfect posture completely collapsed. She leaned forward, squinting, trying to read the dense documents over Julian's shaking shoulder, but he aggressively yanked the binder away, barking a harsh, vicious command at her to back off. She flinched violently, her eyes widening in pure terror. She did not need to understand the complex financial algorithms printed on those pages to comprehend the gravity of the situation. The heavy, suffocating scent of defeat was radiating off Julian in waves. She stood there, clutching her designer handbag like a life preserver, slowly realizing that the wealthy, untouchable man she had tied her youth and future to was currently drowning in a bottomless ocean of legal jeopardy. And he was completely, utterly powerless to save himself. Watching Julian panic in the corridor, my mind briefly drifted away from the courthouse and back to the very foundation of his fragile empire. He had always underestimated my silence, mistaking my quiet nature for ignorance. He forgot who I was long before I became the tired housewife he so eagerly tried to discard. I was a senior compliance data architect at Vanguard Horizon Trust. My entire professional existence revolved around hunting down digital anomalies, tracking invisible money, and building foolproof electronic vaults for people who managed billions of dollars. When Julian first launched his commercial real estate firm, we had absolutely nothing. We barely had enough money to cover our monthly rent, surviving on cheap takeout and sheer ambition, while he was out networking, buying drinks, and shaking hands with investors. I spent thousands of hours awake in the dead of night. I wrote the code and structured the entire financial database his company would eventually run on. I built the architecture from the ground up. I wove the security protocols. I laid the invisible digital pipes that kept his business breathing. He thought it was magic. I knew it was just mathematics, structure, and flawless logic. The shift in his behavior began exactly 2 years ago. It started with the classic, predictable patterns of a man leading a double life. Suddenly, the password to his personal laptop, which had remained the exact same for 7 long years, was changed. He started tilting his phone screen away from my line of sight whenever I entered the room. Then came the endless stream of out-of-town conferences and emergency weekend site visits. He thought he was being incredibly clever, covering his tracks with smooth excuses and trying to gaslight me into believing I was just acting paranoid. But Julian made a fatal miscalculation. He believed his secrets lived exclusively on his mobile phone or in hushed conversations in hotel rooms. He did not realize that true betrayal always leaves a digital footprint. I did not discover the existence of Chloe through a stray text message flashing on a lock screen. I did not find a strange perfume on his collar or a random hotel receipt in his coat pocket. I found her buried deep within a severe loophole in a routine internal audit report. While analyzing a data fetch one evening, I noticed a massive, glaring discrepancy. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in joint assets were slowly bleeding out of our primary accounts. The money was being funneled through a dizzying maze of fabricated business expenses. Julian was actively and systematically liquidating our marital wealth. He was aggressively transferring funds into a vast network of phantom construction companies. These were shell corporations with no physical addresses, no real employees, and absolutely no history of actual labor. He was intentionally draining our shared accounts dry, hiding the capital off the books so that when he finally dropped the divorce papers on my lap, I would be legally entitled to exactly 50% of nothing. And sitting right there in the data, listed as the primary contractor for the largest shell entity, was Chloe. Julian thought locking me out of his user interface would make me blind. He fundamentally misunderstood how information systems work. You can change the locks on the front door all you want, but it does absolutely nothing if the person you are trying to keep out is the architect who secretly kept the master blueprints and built a hidden door to the basement. When I first designed his company network all those years ago, long before the cheating and the endless lies, I wrote a very specific piece of code. It was a failsafe, a phantom automated cross-backup protocol originally designed to protect the company from catastrophic server failures every single day. At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, the system created an encrypted mirror image of every ledger, every invoice, and every single keystroke. It bypassed the main user interface completely and sent those digital ghosts directly to a secure offline server that only I had the credentials to access. Julian had been incredibly busy deleting his digital history, actively doctoring the front-end ledgers to make the missing money look like bad investments and unfortunate market losses. He had no idea that beneath the surface, my invisible protocol was quietly archiving his crimes. It captured the exact dates, the destination routing numbers, and the precise IP addresses from which he authorized every single fraudulent wire transfer. It recorded his meticulous theft day after day, month after month, year after year. I watched him steal my future, and I let him do it. I did not confront him. I did not scream, cry, or demand answers. I simply sat back in the shadows and let my backup server compile the most airtight, irrefutable federal fraud case imaginable. He spent 2 entire years digging a bottomless pit to bury me in, completely unaware that I was the one supplying the shovels and documenting every single load of dirt. As I stood in the corridor watching him sweat, my mind wandered to the true depth of his cruelty. The infidelity was a sharp knife. Yes, but sleeping with a 24-year-old girl was merely a pathetic cliché. The true, unforgivable betrayal was the trap he painstakingly laid out to destroy my life completely. He did not just want to leave me. He wanted to ensure I was buried alive beneath a mountain of fabricated liabilities. While digging through the encrypted backups, I discovered something that made my blood run absolutely cold. He had forged my physical signature on dozens of commercial loan documents. With a few deliberate strokes of a pen, Julian had legally positioned me as the sole guarantor for over $3 million in high-interest debt. This massive debt was tied directly to the phantom construction companies he had created. If his plan succeeded, I would not just be a divorced woman walking away empty-handed. I would be completely bankrupt, hunted by aggressive collection agencies, and potentially facing federal prison time for defaulting on massive corporate loans I knew absolutely nothing about. To make sure I could never fight back or defend myself, he orchestrated a systematic assassination of my professional and personal character. Julian began whispering poison into the ears of every influential person in the Chicago business circuit. He attended gala dinners, charity auctions, and corporate retreats, flawlessly playing the role of the tragic, suffering husband. He told our mutual friends, our prominent investors, and my own industry peers that I had suffered a severe, catastrophic mental breakdown. He spread vicious, calculated lies that I was battling crippling, untreated depression and had become completely legally and mentally incapacitated. He claimed I was dangerously unstable, prone to wild, paranoid delusions about his business operations. The elite circles of Chicago are incredibly small and brutally unforgiving. Almost overnight, my entire professional network evaporated into thin air. People I had known for over a decade suddenly stopped returning my phone calls. Former partners and colleagues looked at me with a sickening mixture of pity and fear when I tried to approach them. I was completely ostracized, treated like a ghost haunting my own life, stripped of my community and quietly pushed out of the very industry I had spent my entire adult life helping to conquer. I was forced to retreat into the shadows. I packed my essential belongings, moved out of the expansive, sunlit estate we had shared, and signed a lease for a cramped, drafty apartment on the industrial edge of the city. For 6 agonizing months, that tiny, depressing space became my entire universe. The walls felt like they were constantly closing in on me, echoing with the deafening silence of my absolute isolation. The only sound keeping me company was the constant, mechanical hum of a cheap refrigerator and the rhythmic tapping of my computer keyboard. In the beginning, the sheer magnitude of his malice threatened to break my spirit entirely. There were nights when the freezing air in that apartment bit into my skin, and the urge to collapse onto the cheap linoleum floor and scream until my throat bled was almost overpowering. The pain of being discarded, slandered, and framed by the man I loved was a physical weight pressing down on my chest, threatening to crush my lungs. But I made a solemn, unbreakable vow to myself in the darkness of that tiny bedroom. I would not give him the satisfaction of a single tear. Crying would not pay off the forged debts. Weeping would not magically clear my ruined reputation. I took every ounce of my agonizing pain, every shred of my broken heart, and forged it into a weapon of pure, uncompromising focus. I turned my cramped living room into a digital war room. I drank bitter black coffee until my hands shook, spending every waking hour of my free time manually decoding the monstrously complex double bookkeeping system he had implemented. It was a terrifying labyrinth of hidden ledgers, fake invoices, and encrypted offshore routing numbers, intentionally designed to confuse, misdirect, and exhaust any standard financial auditor. But Julian forgot that I was not a standard auditor. I was the architect of his reality. Line by agonizing line, transaction by fraudulent transaction, I completely unraveled his financial tapestry. I traced the forged digital signatures directly back to the specific IP address of his personal office computer. I linked the massive cash withdrawals to the hidden shell accounts. I silently and methodically gathered irrefutable, ironclad evidence proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that my husband was not just a cheating spouse, but the arrogant mastermind behind a massive, multi-million-dollar federal financial fraud syndicate. Every sleepless night in that miserable apartment was a heavy stone I carefully laid to build his inescapable prison. The allotted 15 minutes evaporated completely. When the heavy courtroom doors finally swung open again, the dynamic of the entire room had violently inverted. Julian and his high-priced attorney dragged themselves back to the defense table, moving with the sluggish, terrified hesitation of men marching toward an execution. The suffocating weight of impending doom hung thickly in the air. Julian looked physically ill. His complexion had turned a sickly, pale shade of green, and his hands trembled uncontrollably as he slumped heavily into his chair. Judge Thorne struck his wooden gavel once, the sharp, violent crack slicing through the tense silence. "Court is back in session," he announced, his voice vibrating with absolute, undeniable authority. "Counsel, I assume you have reviewed the petitioner's supplementary file?" Julian's attorney stood up. His knees were visibly shaking. He desperately clutched the edge of the mahogany table for physical support, knuckles turning white. "Your Honor," the lawyer stammered, his voice stripped of every single ounce of its previous arrogance. "In light of this newly presented, highly complex information, the defense formally requests to immediately withdraw our initial settlement offer. We humbly ask the court for a 60-day continuance to properly review these extensive documents and restructure our terms." "Motion denied," Judge Thorne fired back instantly, not even blinking. "You submitted a legally binding offer to this court just 30 minutes ago. We are going to address the glaring, criminal discrepancies between your client's sworn financial affidavit and the reality of his bank accounts right now." This was my moment, the culmination of 6 months of agonizing isolation and thousands of hours of decoding. I did not wait for my own counsel to speak. I pushed my chair back, stood up straight, and looked directly at the man who had spent the last 2 years trying to destroy my sanity and my life. I felt no fear, no hesitation, and absolutely no pity. I was a weapon forged in the searing fire of his own betrayal, and I was finally ready to strike the fatal blow. "Your Honor," I spoke clearly, my voice ringing out strong and steady, echoing off the high wood-paneled walls. "If I may direct the court's attention to Section 4, Exhibit B of the supplementary dossier, the defense claims extreme poverty and insurmountable business debts. However, the data architecture I personally designed for Vance Commercial Real Estate tells a vastly different, deeply criminal story. Over the past 24 months, precisely $5 million in joint marital assets and corporate capital were systematically siphoned out of our primary holding accounts." Julian stared at me in absolute horror, his jaw practically hitting the floor. He had never seen me like this. He had only known the quiet, supportive wife who handled the background tasks, never the ruthless, uncompromising architect of his complete ruin. "That $5 million did not simply vanish into poor market investments," I continued, my words cutting through the sterile air like a serrated blade. "The funds were artificially laundered through a complex network of 7 different phantom construction companies. The evidence shows that once the money was sufficiently washed, it was aggregated and wired directly into a highly classified, private trust fund, completely hidden from the public record." "Lies!" Julian suddenly screamed, completely losing all semblance of professional control. He leaped out of his chair, pointing a violently shaking finger at me. "She is lying. She fabricated all of this data to ruin me. I do not know anything about any offshore trusts or phantom companies. My chief accountant manages all the daily ledgers. If there is money missing, he is the one who stole it. He went completely rogue. I had absolutely no knowledge of these illegal transactions." His pathetic, shrill outburst echoed in the quiet courtroom. It was the desperate, flailing defense of a trapped animal. He was perfectly willing to throw his loyal employees under a federal bus, risking their freedom just to save his own skin. Judge Thorne did not yell. He did not need to raise his voice at all. The sheer, freezing contempt radiating from his eyes was enough to silence the entire room. He slowly picked up a single sheet of paper from my binder, holding it up into the light. "Mr. Vance," the judge said, his voice dangerously soft but laced with pure legal venom. "Before you say another word, I highly recommend you remember that you are currently under oath. Perjury is a severe felony. You claim you had no knowledge of these transactions. Yet, I am looking at a master wire transfer order, dated exactly 4 months ago, moving $800,000 directly into this hidden trust. This document bears your exact authenticated digital signature." Julian swallowed hard, thick beads of sweat dripping down his forehead and stinging his eyes. "Digital signatures can be hacked, Your Honor. Anyone in the IT department could have done it." "Perhaps," Judge Thorne replied, leaning forward, resting his heavy forearms on the bench and glaring down like a bird of prey. "But this specific transfer was not just digitally signed. The security protocol embedded deep in the system traced the exact origin of the authorization. It was authenticated and executed directly from the specific IP address of the private computer located securely inside your locked home office. Furthermore, the internal keystroke logs verify your personal biometric administrative password was utilized. Do you expect this court to believe your chief accountant broke into your house, bypassed your personal security, and wired massive funds to a secret account without your knowledge?" Checkmate. The silence that followed was absolute and terrifying. It was the unmistakable sound of a man's entire life shattering into a million irreparable pieces. Julian stood completely frozen, his mouth opening and closing silently like a suffocated fish, unable to formulate a single coherent lie to counter the raw, undeniable mathematical truth. Right next to him, his aggressive, high-priced attorney made a rapid, calculated decision regarding his own professional survival. The lawyer realized instantly that his client had just lied to a judge, submitted a fraudulent financial affidavit, and committed severe federal financial crimes right in front of him. He wanted absolutely no part of the massive legal explosion that was about to occur. The lawyer aggressively snapped his heavy leather briefcase shut. He did not look at Julian. He physically took 2 large, deliberate steps backward, creating a clear, undeniable distance between himself and the sinking ship. "Your Honor," the attorney stated, his voice completely hollow and strictly professional, "as an officer of the court, I must inform you that I can no longer, in good faith, stand by the financial affidavits previously submitted by my client. Furthermore, effective immediately, I must respectfully withdraw as Mr. Vance's legal counsel in this matter due to a severe and irreconcilable conflict of interest regarding his testimony today. I refuse to defend these statements." He was abandoning ship. It was the ultimate betrayal among thieves. Julian turned to his lawyer, his eyes wide with desperate panic, but the attorney refused to even make eye contact. The steel trap I had so painstakingly built over the last 6 months had not just snapped shut, it had completely pulverized him. The absolute destruction of Julian was not quite complete. There was one final revelation waiting in the shadows of the paperwork, a carefully hidden detail that would deliver the ultimate, fatal blow to his fragile kingdom. Judge Thorne did not immediately dismiss the court. He watched the cowardly lawyer scramble out of the room, then slowly turned his attention back to the massive binder. He flipped to the final section of my financial autopsy. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the soft rustle of the thick paper. "Mr. Vance," the judge said, his voice completely devoid of any sympathy, "it takes a truly spectacular level of arrogance to commit federal fraud. However, it takes a uniquely repulsive kind of cowardice to use another human being as a legal meat shield for your own crimes. This court has thoroughly reviewed the establishment documents for the offshore trust currently holding the illicit $5 million. Julian flinched as if he had been physically struck. He knew exactly what was coming next. Judge Thorne raised his head and shifted his severe gaze directly toward the gallery, landing squarely on the young, blonde woman sitting in the second row. "The sole beneficiary and legally documented owner of the trust holding the stolen funds is not you, Mr. Vance, the judge declared loudly. The account is registered under the name Chloe Vaughn. This makes her the primary recipient of laundered money and an official documented accomplice in a massive financial conspiracy. The words hit the room like a bomb. Chloe gasped. A sharp, ragged sound of pure terror. The smug, victorious aura she had worn all morning vanished entirely, replaced by the horrifying realization of her own legal jeopardy. She thought she was just dating a wealthy older man who bought her expensive dinners and designer clothes. She had no idea he had secretly weaponized her identity, putting her directly in the crosshairs of federal prosecutors. "You did what to me?" Chloe shrieked, completely abandoning any sense of courtroom decorum. She jumped up from the wooden bench, her designer handbag crashing loudly to the floor. Julian spun around, his face pale and panicked, raising his hands in a desperate attempt to quiet her. "Chloe, please, just calm down. We can fix this. I will explain everything." "Fix this?" she screamed, her voice echoing wildly off the high ceilings. "You put my name on $5 million of stolen money? You set me up to go to federal prison so you could protect yourself?" Before the bailiff could even step forward, Chloe lunged across the wooden divider. She raised her hand and delivered a vicious, echoing slap directly across Julian's face. The sharp crack rang out like a gunshot. Julian stumbled backward, clutching his reddening cheek in total disbelief. "I am not going to jail for you!" Chloe yelled hysterically as the bailiff grabbed her arms and pulled her back. "I will tell them everything. Every password. Every secret meeting. Every single lie you told. I am turning state's witness." The judge struck his gavel repeatedly, demanding order, but the damage was permanently done. Julian sat completely paralyzed. He had lost everything in the span of 30 minutes. He was entirely stripped of his wealth, abandoned by his legal counsel, and violently betrayed by the young mistress he had destroyed our marriage for. When order was finally restored, Judge Thorne delivered the final judgment. He completely nullified the exploitative settlement agreement. With a few decisive strokes of his pen, he awarded me 100% of the legitimate business shares, the primary residence, and all remaining clean capital in our joint accounts. Furthermore, citing extreme financial abuse and malicious intent, he ordered a massive punitive judgment against Julian to compensate for the agonizing emotional distress I had endured over the past 2 years. "Finally," Judge Thorne concluded, glaring down at the broken man before him, "I am officially forwarding this entire unredacted file directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service. I highly suggest you do not attempt to leave the city. Mr. Vance, we are adjourned." The heavy strike of the gavel signaled the absolute end of my nightmare. I calmly gathered my belongings, stood up, and walked down the center aisle. I did not look at Julian as he sat sobbing quietly at the defense table, waiting for the authorities to arrive. I pushed open the heavy oak doors and walked out into the corridor, my footsteps steady and proud. When I finally stepped outside the Cook County Courthouse, the bright midday sun temporarily blinded me. The crisp, cold wind coming off Lake Michigan hit my face, and for the first time in 6 months, my chest did not feel tight. I took a deep, greedy breath of the fresh Chicago air. I was no longer the discarded, slandered wife hiding in a cramped apartment. I was free, fiercely wealthy, and standing on the threshold of a brilliant new life, leaving the wreckage of his arrogance far behind me. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Violet Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.